My Lords, I rise once again to follow Lord Davies of Brixton and rather uncharacteristically wish to associate myself with many of the comments that he made. I support the thrust of Amendment 2 and wider support of the other amendments in this group. Now, my qualifications to speak on this bill insofar as the LGPS elements are concerned is that I was a leader of a local authority for 20 years and a member of the Norfolk Pensions Committee since 2007. I've been a member of the Local Government Pension Scheme Advisory Board since inception in 2014. I'm a past member of the Fire Services Scheme Advisory Board. I'm a trustee of a number of private schemes and benefit from my own SIP. So, my Lords, today is about the LGPS, and it's different, because not many of the public sector schemes have money put aside for their members' retirement, although I accept the MPs are one of them. Now, in aggregate, the LGPS comprises 89 separate schemes cast throughout the entirety of the 4 home nations. Collectively, the 2024 scheme census tells us there was a total of 6.7 million members, directionally, a third active, a third deferred, and a third actually in payment. Total assets under management in 2024 were £390 billion. It's much more than that. Now, these things change, but by whatever measure, the LGPS is the world's 4th or 5th largest pension scheme. Now, when I came onto the Norfolk board in 2007, assets under management were £1.8 billion. They're now over £6 billion. And I echo the comments of Lord Davies. If only the UK economy had risen in that proportion. The LGPS delivers significant value. The typical member is a 47-year-old woman earning about £18,000 a year, for whom the pension is, as Lord Davies says, about £5,000. It's incredibly efficient. Operational costs are about half that of the typical unfunded schemes, and in the Norfolk scheme, of which I'm a member, the cost per member is less than £20 per head. Now, I do accept that other schemes have costs higher than that, but it's an enviable record. We've saved for our future. But not you'd know any of this from the thrust of the bill and its overbearing tinkering. What is the problem to be solved here? After some difficult times when interest rates were low, most schemes are now fully funded. It is a British success story. A success story that will be undermined by fettering the independence of schemes to make the best long-term investment decisions for their members and the local taxpayers, muddling accountabilities by divorcing assets from liabilities and introducing new conflicts of interest. That can't be right. The success has been delivered despite being buffeted by complications like MacLeod, the pre- and post-2015 schemes, GMP, the Rule of 75, dashboards, changing rules on inheritance and divorce, and all the other things that happen when you have the best interests of 6.7 million workers in mind. Because the truth is that the LGPS is a million miles away from the fat cattery that the popular newspapers would have you believe. Which brings me on to the substance of Amendment 2. I have the greatest concerns that the fiduciary duty contemplated in this bill to the members, the fairness to the taxpayer, and that ham-fisted interference from a merry-go-round of local government finance ministers will weaken this jewel in our economic crown. Taken together, subclauses 2 to 8 promote the notion that the government's nanny knows best, with broad powers down to that level of detail to determine the fine structure of the pooled schemes. This approach has already damaged the scheme for no good reason. The exemplar access band has been told to disband. It was doing a good job. With nearly £40 billion worth of assets under management, it rented the best globally viewed FCA qualified professionals in the City of London, one of the world's top 3 financial centres. Now they're being forced to join a pool of other authorities, headquartered miles away in the provinces, miles away from the cut and thrust, and that leading intellectual property. There's a provision in subclause 7 that these pools should take steps to get FCA accreditation. I suppose we should be grateful for that. But these pools have no business even being on the battlefield until they're FCA qualified. Thus is the muddle of this bill. In essence, this enforced uniformity means that the star strikers have been replaced by the subs from the reserve team, a global success story weakened with the risk of lower returns for members. Now, moving on. This bill talks about local government members, but the scheme isn't just about councils. In the Norfolk scheme, which I know best, there are 8 principal councils, but we've now got over 500 sponsoring employers: parish councils, care homes, catering companies, youth and social working, classroom assistants, charities. Each of these has different scale, covenant strength and longevity. It's really complex. Yet ministerial interference wants to shove them all into a one-size scheme that can't fit all. In subclause 5, we see the touching faith in the judgment of the experts and regulators who'd forced the private schemes into LDIs and ruined them. I don't know why the pensions regulator and GAD isn't on the government's list. I suppose we should be grateful that they're not. But this whole bill promulgates that pensions groupthink on the altar of reduced risk and lower returns. I will deal with the Amendment 5 later in the group because it talks about investment. There's a later group for that. Now, I've heard the Minister say that bigger is better. And here again, I align myself with Lord Davies. It's the thrust and the theme of this bill more widely. Indeed, at the dispatch box, I heard the noble Baroness lionise the Ontario Teachers' Scheme in the week they were rinsed for £1 billion in the collapse of Thames Water. And we see in Clause 2 there'll be directions as to what things can be invested in. When they tried that in Sweden, the public schemes lost another $1 billion in the Northvolt disaster, where virtue signalling political investment directions made the members and taxpayers poorer. The harsh lesson is that the schemes become the plaything of meddlesome ministers to require or prohibit or to opine on lofty ideas, but without the responsibility or accountability of paying out. And it's wrong. Now, I'm not against appropriate scale. There have been a lot of small schemes in the 500 million size, which I accept can and should be bulked up. Although one of the smallest schemes in the LGPS, the Orkney scheme, has never changed its fund manager and has the best return of all the schemes in the whole thing. Now, there's something to be learned from that. The power to direct how local government funds should be invested should not be determined by the dead hand of Marsham Street. I notice we don't have any MHCLG representatives here, ministerial representatives here. It's that interference from there that contaminates the fiduciary duty and damages returns, and their indifference by not being here informs our approach. Now, the real problem with excessive scale pooling and the sort of ministerial directions contemplated by Clause 2 is that you don't get scale where you need it, and you have too much scale where you don't. Now, let me explain. An example of infrastructure in investment. The LGPS has £400 billion of AUM. The rule of thumb is that a scheme would have about 10%, say 40 billion, for that allocation for infrastructure. Now, split across half a dozen pools, it's only 4 or 5 billion each. It's not going to be a needle mover. There really should be a single national pool for infrastructure investment for the LGPS. But what's this? Subclause 6 prevents that because inexplicably a scheme can't be in more than one pool. It's crazy. What a missed opportunity. So instead we're going to have £50 billion investment pools. Now, these are huge entities, but here you've got too much scale. The schemes are just too big to invest in the smaller British companies with great growth potential who might need a few million to get to the next stage. The consequence of all this is that British companies who are crying out for long-term patient capital are going to go hungry. It directly contradicts the Mansion House objectives and aggravates the paradox of reducing illiquidity. The bigger you get, you need to make such large investments that you start to move the market yourself. And with all the other schemes getting bigger as well, they all end up chasing the same opportunities in a bubbleomics. And as the ministers make their decisions, there are costs and expenses of the whole transition, which my noble friend has mentioned, and the insanity of forcing a fire sale of private equity assets, which typically mature over 10 years. It's wrong, and we're placing our schemes in no man's land, too big to be small, too small to be too big, and worse, divorcing the local taxpayer from the assets and the liabilities. Now let's talk about the risks of passive tracker funds, which lead you into bubbles. In fact, in today's newspapers, the fund manager, Terry Smith, calls them laying the foundations of a major investment disaster. Yes, they're cheap. Yes, they can work well when the market is rising, but you get badly burned in the downtown. And now is not the time for ministers to mandate putting even more money into trackers, forced into like a herd, into overinflated AI bubble, when you've got the retirement savings of 6 million people in mind. Look, I'm not against pooling in principle, but having spent 20 years... I'm coming to a conclusion. So having spent 20 years at the coalface with some of the brightest and smartest professionals from around the world, if we persist with 2 to 8, we're going to be further in hock to a Treasury that has demonstrated they don't understand the interplay between revenue and capital, and in fact the underlying principles of the capitalist economy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, and now is not the time to meddle in the LGPS.